job. You did just come from a trip to the Pacific. I do want to hear all about it. And I thought today we would talk about, we'll talk the big picture. There's a lot of change facing the Navy, and a lot of people assume there's going to be change. Some maybe want different change than you want. And maybe we'll get to some nitty gritty, and hopefully by the end of this, you'll have made a whole lot of screaming headlines for all the journalists to write today.
I avoid the headlines.
well, that's my mission today. First of all, I wanted to note, I watched your confirmation hearing and some of your early speeches, and there's a line in your hearing where you said, "I know the value of freedom and democracy because I was born in a country with neither." Where were you born?
I was born in Havana, Cuba, in 1961.
How does that affect the kind of Navy secretary you're going to be? And that may sound pithy, but you have a unique background, a unique beginning, a unique family story, and it comes at this moment in American history where diversity and inclusion is forefront in everything, even in the Pentagon.
I think it has a tremendous effect on my conduct as Secretary of the Navy. And I would argue that all immigrants who come to this country perhaps sometimes view life and the challenges that we face as a nation through a slightly different lens. And so, for example, as I look at what President Biden has clearly made our pacing threat, and Secretary Austin talks about it so much, China, being born in a communist country gives you a different perspective. You do lose all your freedoms. And you come to the realization that communist countries, generally speaking, have one main goal, and is that the self-preservation of power, to keep their own communist party in power and to control their own people. And so having had that life perspective for me is very educational in how I see the relationship between China and the United States and Russia and other nations.
I take it when you hear politicians throw the word around like socialist, it has a different meaning for you.
Well, there are elements of socialism that are good. However, when they're exercised in the way that communist countries exercise socialism, that's not a good thing. And because it typically means that communist countries are trying to gain control of their people and their freedoms in every possible way to their own advantage and to the detriment of the people that they rule.
Let's talk about the future of the Navy, and I have a lot of notes on my phone, so forgive me. I'm actually not tweeting for 30 minutes, which is rare for me, but we'll get to the tweets. You're the 78th
Yes.
Navy Secretary. In the last administration, there were 5.
Yes.
We went through Richard Spencer, who was fired, Thomas Maudley resigned in controversy, McPherson, Braithwaite, Thomas Harker, and then finally to you. When did you have your first conversation with someone from the Biden team about taking this job?
I had my first conversations with the Biden team around the March timeframe.
Yeah.
And they reached out to me about the possibility of filling the shoes of Secretary of the Navy.
So you came on board kind of right when the budget was just about to drop already.
Yes.
So this budget predates you.
Yes,
and the
it
NDAA that governs it is we don't know when it's going to drop or going to be passed, but it's fairly underway. So do you have any chance to put input into the current NDAA in the next budget coming out?
I had an opportunity certainly to talk to all our senators through my confirmation hearing process. And I also had opportunities to talk to the administration as well about the ongoing efforts that were in place in discussion of the fiscal year 22 budget, as well as the 23 POM. Yeah. This is my 12th week, so right. My first 4 weeks were, quite frankly, consumed by Afghanistan, all things Afghanistan. I did have about 2 weeks to put my own imprint on the Navy POM that had to be submitted. So I feel like I've been able to weigh in, at least initially, and to affect the priorities that I think the Department of the Navy needs moving forward.
Tell us the state of all of the Navy's plans and doctrines and studies, because there are a lot of them going on, and I'll review for the audience here some of them. In September Defense One, we hosted your counterpart, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Gilday, who said that it might not be till 2023 that the Navy gets its next real new fleet plan, because the fleet plan that flows from a force study design, which would be the Navy's 4th in recent years, it follows the 2019's Integrated Naval Force Structure Assessment, Battle Force 2045, which was completed October of last year. This year earlier was the Biden administration put out a shipbuilding document, and we're all waiting for DoD to come out with a global posture review for the entire force laydown, which we've heard from Admiral Gilday thought at least That has to be informed by a new national defense strategy, which has to be informed by a national security strategy from the White House. So how far away are we from any real change for the Navy?
Well, there's lots of studies and lots of strategies out there that are being developed. However, they are in many ways interlinked and intertwined and quite consistent with each other, quite frankly. In the Department of the Navy, I largely guide myself by the Commandant of the Marine Corps Force Design 2030 and the Chief of Naval Operations Navigation Plan. And I've studied those both quite extensively. I think they're pretty sound documents. We've been putting them into effect over the last couple of years. My desire is to, quite frankly, to be able to resource them properly so that we can actually bring them into fruition and execute on them over the course of the fit-up.
I want to ask about the resources, but before then, so you've read those documents, you've gotten your feet wet in the Navy. Philosophically, why does this nation need a Navy? What is the purpose of the modern Navy, given the state of the world today, the threat assessments that you're reading, all these documents that you've gone through?
Well, the purpose of the Navy hasn't changed much, actually, since the days of the Constitution. It's really to protect our nation's economic interests and our national security interests, to be able to maintain the sea lanes of communications and trade open globally. As you all know, over 85% of our nation's trade, those packages that you receive at your home from Amazon, much of that actually begins in places overseas and it's transported over the seas to our country where it's delivered to your front doorstep. And there's also the digital trade that takes place internationally as well too. That takes place through cables and fiber lines underseas that we protect globally.
So give us your priorities. You've put out a strategic guidance, as lots of new officials do when they first come in. It's a short document, but you call it your 4 Cs, right?
I do. It starts with China as our most significant pacing threat. China's intent to one day take over Taiwan, either peacefully or through military means, has the most serious impact on our economic security of this country and for the destabilization of the global economy, for that matter. So they are the pacing threat, and they are our number one threat that we have to pay attention to. That doesn't mean that we don't take our eyes off the many other threats that exist, including those presented by Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and many other countries, and the terrorist threat that always is relevant everywhere around the world as well. But China is unquestionably the most significant threat. That's followed by attention to culture in the Navy, which I find it's very important to maintain a culture of dignity and respect for all our sailors and Marines and civilian personnel who serve in the Navy. Climate as well, that presents an existential threat to our national security in many different ways. And then COVID as well too. And I'm proud to say that with regards to COVID, the Navy today is 99.4% vaccinated, which is a tremendous number. And our Marine Corps is very close to 95% vaccinated now. So hopefully I could start talking about perhaps the 3 Cs.
Exactly, and get rid of COVID. That'd be nice. I'll ask you about COVID. Today, we have breaking news just before we came on stage. The Biden administration is delaying its requirement that federal contractors be vaccinated until January 4th. The deadline was going to be next week, I believe. And it's significant because we had reported that couple of shipyards, at least in Marinette and at Groton, had said that back in like September or so that they thought that maybe only 50% of shipbuilders in their yards were vaccinated. And more recently, at one of the other shipyards, I think Bath, they said that they'd gotten up to 70%. But in reality, they were facing the option of either laying off or firing thousands of shipyard workers. So how significant is this delay, and could you also speak to this, just the general state of American shipbuilding? There's a sense that I don't want to mention the 355 ship Navy because it becomes a trope that people hang their politics on.
You could mention it.
But how is this country going to be able to expand any kind of shipbuilding or Navy with the shipbuilding capacity that we have today?
Sure.
Doesn't the United States need vastly more capacity for shipbuilding?
So let me address the first question with regards to COVID in the shipyards. So I think this is something that we'll be able to very effectively work through. It's a little bit more complicated, obviously, in the private sector for our contractors and our shipyards. But I think that they're really making great attempts to try to educate their workforce that, it just simply makes sense to get vaccinated. It's a matter of health security for themselves, and the health security of our own Department of the Navy workforce as well too. So I feel confident that delaying it till January is not a major issue. It'll allow us a little bit of extra time to sort of work through the legal details and many other details that the shipyards and other contractors need to work through in order to get to the right place in time. And over time, I do feel confident that those percentages of vaccinations will go up significantly, just like they did in the Department of the Navy. So I don't think it's a major issue, quite frankly.
Well, go ahead.
Would you like me to talk about the, okay. So today, China has 17 shipyards throughout all of China. Last year they built 20 Navy warships. This year they're on track to build another 20 Navy warships. It's a significant threat. And so when we look at our shipbuilding capability, I am concerned that we need to make greater investments in shipbuilding in order to get us to par with 2018 NDAA. Basically, they called for 355 ships, which is a desirable goal for the Department of the Navy, obviously. In order to get there, we're going to have to increase resources by at least 3 to 5% over inflation. And that would be an honorable goal for the Department of the Navy to be able to do so.
Right. I mean, that's the current law. You've said in your Annapolis speech that the United States needs urgency with keeping up the pace with China. 20 ships a year. The United States is not keeping up that pace. Is the U.S. or is Congress acting with enough urgency?
Well, I think we're raising the alarm, certainly.
Yeah.
And I think more members of Congress understand the real threat that China presents, not just to our national security, but our economic security. I think they'll become more willing to invest more in the Department of the Navy, both the Navy and the Marine Corps.
A couple hardware items to ask about, on the same vein. One is on destroyers. You commanded a destroyer.
I did.
And so, and I think I heard you say you lived at a shipyard while it was being built, right?
I did. I spent a year and a half in the shipyard building the USS Berkeley in Pascagoula, Mississippi, and I spent a year and a half on sea trials.
So Bath Iron Works has said that it would have to cut 2,400 shipbuilding jobs before the year 2024 if the Navy doesn't place a large long-term order for more of those ships. Mm-hmm. How do you respond to that? Is that an honest, is that just an honest presentation of the facts, or is that a typical big defense contractor just trying to put the squeeze on the Pentagon?
I served in the private sector for 17 years, and so it was important for companies to clearly understand what the demand signal is moving forward. But in the case of Bath, Maine, I'm quite confident that we'll be seeing multi-year procurements in the future in support of building our DDG class of destroyers that will support a continued stable workforce at Bath and also at Pascagoula.
Similar question, the future of the FA-18s. Production is set to close in 2024. The Navy has requested to end this before your tenure, to move on to other aircraft. But Congress, the House, at least in the NEH, wants to put in $1 billion more to buy more, and there might be foreign purchases as well. If Super Hunter production ends, what risk does that bring to, for example, carrier groups in the Pacific? Sure.
Well, it's shutting down the F-18 ENF line basically for future aircraft in the Department of the Navy is a decision made in order to be able to support the future purchases of the F-35B, which is a far more significantly capable aircraft that we're looking at for operational use in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere to be able to meet the significantly increasing capabilities of the Chinese. So it does have a negative impact in a world where often budgets don't grow at a pace that you'd want them to grow. So it's a trade-off basically and a balance that you have to make between those two, which is why the Navy has been pushing so hard for more purchases of the F-35B and C.
Are you staying with that approach? You're still calling for the end of the 18s?
Yeah, I support the president's current budget and the decision that was made in this case.
We're already with 7 minutes to go, which drives me crazy. But we have within the last 5 minutes, I'll call us on some questions. If you have some, get them ready, get your hand up, and microphones will come your way. China, I didn't mean to skip over it earlier. You mentioned, with 20 ships a year coming out. The answer probably is not to try to match them ship for ship. It's going to have to be something else. What do you envision? I mean, what are your early thoughts on the type of Navy, the priorities that you're going to need to check down China's competitiveness?
And that's exactly correct. It's not just about the number of ships, it's about the capacity that they bring, the capability that they bring to the table, the lethality that they bring, and we obviously want to be able to build the most modern ships that we can, right, while maintaining some of the legacy ships that we have to be able to fight the conflict should it present itself in the next 2 to 3 years, for example. So it's a balance between all of those together. And my hope is that we can maintain a stable capacity to be able to meet the threat over the course of the next 2 to 3 years, and then make major investments in modernization so that we can make them that more capable. So if you take the Zumwalt class of ship, for example, major investments that we're making in hypersonic missiles, by being able to convert the VLS tubes on the Zumwalt class of ships, that prevents a really formidable deterrent to China in the next 5 to 6 years.
The USS Constitution submarine in the news lately for hitting something, reportedly a seamount underwater in the South China Sea. What can you tell us that's happened and what's happening with that?
The Connecticut. I was a little worried. You said that the USS Constitution.
Did I say the Constitution? I meant the Connecticut. Constitution is probably safe in Boston still.
That's right. That's right. Yes, the Connecticut, as has been broadcast, had hit a uncharted seamount. An investigation is underway, and I really can't comment more until the investigations are complete. But I'm confident that the investigations will determine if individuals need to be held accountable, and if they do need to be held accountable, they will be held accountable.
All right, last question for the audience. Special operations after Afghanistan. There's some concern in this community that the good news is there's less conflict, less combat, less battlefield danger, but that also means less experience to be had and a different kind of training that's needed for special operators like Navy SEALs to be ready and able for a whole new generation of them, frankly, to have the same sort of capability and readiness. Do you have any thoughts, or have you given thought to what kind of shift needs to happen and what effect really the end of Afghanistan operations has, if it's as much as or less as people may think, on the churn of naval special operations and training and capabilities?
Well, with the focus on 20 years of land warfare, basically in the Middle East, to deterring China in the Indo-Pacific, which is very much a maritime and Air Force dominated theater, all our warfare specialties are shifting basically to how they contribute to the fight in the Indo-Pacific and deterring China in every possible way, and that includes our special forces as well too. But after all the work that they've done in the Middle East, they are extremely proficient at what they do. It's just a matter of shifting their operations now to the Indo-Pacific and to a slightly different operational requirement for them to be able to effectively do their mission. And without going into too many details, I assure you that we're doing that.
Culture is one of your C's. Are you planning any types of new dives into Navy SEAL culture?
No, I mean, culture for me really is about treating every individual with dignity and respect, regardless of who they are, their religion, the color of their skin, their gender, who they care to love, or anything else. We are professionals in the Department of the Navy and the Department of Defense, and we have a requirement to treat each other with dignity and respect as professionals. That equates directly to combat readiness, because in combat and in conflict, people have to be able to trust each other. And part of that trust is treating each other with dignity and respect. So for me, it's a standard of excellence by which we have to live by every single day and hold people accountable who choose not to. Okay, rapid fire questions. So audience members, we have a hand right here in the front. If there's a microphone coming your way. We have a couple minutes. Maybe we can get 2 or 3 if there's others. Sure. We'll keep them quick.
Thanks for joining us, Mr. Secretary. My name is Jack Hanley. I'm one of the ASG Rising leaders and a U.S. Navy Surface Warfare Officer. Sir, I wanted to ask you a question about the recent report on the fighting culture in the Surface Navy, and kind of piggybacking on what you've been talking about, our war fighting culture and some of the shortfalls we've been seeing. Your comments on the report, sir, and then what we can do to help improve that culture. Thank you.
Yeah. So I believe we have a very strong warfighting culture in the Department of the Navy. You know, today, just in the Department of the Navy, we have 135,000 sailors and Marines deployed globally. That's a higher number than we've had actually since 2014. It's extraordinary. And I just came back from a 10-day trip to the Indo-Pacific, for example, where I visit destroyers, submarines, aircraft carriers. I went on the Japanese converted destroyer Izumo, for example. And you know, the warfighting culture that we have, I think, is extraordinary. It really has. And yes, we did have some very unfortunate accidents that took place 5 years ago. And you know, the Navy, the surface Navy in this case, invested millions of dollars actually into improving their training in Newport, Rhode Island, their simulators. There were a lot of in-depth studies that were done. We've increased actually the number of personnel on our destroyers, for example. The training that takes place for executive officers and commanding officers has really been reinforced. I've taken a very close look at this in the last 8 weeks or so, and I'm really impressed with the investments that we made. I'm proud of the warfighting culture that we have, and I'm confident that the Department of the Navy will be able to stand up and fulfill its mission to the American people.
One more question in the far corner, the woman with glasses, yes. And that'll have to be it with our last time.
Thank you so much. Good morning, Secretary. Because we're so glad to see you here today. I want to follow up on the 4 C's that you've been talking about, specifically climate. And when I look at climate challenges, I really think about the Navy. I think about the North Pole area and the challenges there. Could you go into a little bit more depth or point us in the direction on who we can go to within your organization? Because industry wants to help. We just need to know what you want, need, and how we can support you. So the focus is climate. What is the Navy going to do, and what can the American industrial base do to help you? Thank you.
Well, in case I can't answer all your questions in 1 minute, the person to go to is actually the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Meredith Berger, for energy installations and the environment. And our Navy team is actually doing a great job trying to make the right investments, technological and otherwise, to be able to lower our carbon footprint, for example, to make technological advancements on our platforms at sea, but also ashore as well too. Both those require some major investments over the course of the next few years. And it's just critically important. If you just take the cybersecurity building that was built at the Naval Academy recently, for example, that building was completely designed with the environment in mind. And if you just take a look at the fact that the Severn River flooded just, I think it was 2 weeks ago, or in the last 2 weeks, we can continue to operate that building because of the engineering designs that we put into it to keep it functional even when the Severn floods over into the Naval Academy. So there's a lot of exciting technologies that we're looking at across the board, and I really do encourage you to reach out, and I'd be happy to put you in touch with the Assistant Secretary to continue that conversation. But without question, the biggest threat that we face with regards to climate is the shortage of fresh water globally, and the rising conflicts that the fight for fresh water will create between nations, and we have to find a way. It's not a military solution. Diplomacy and many other things that have to come into play, a whole of government approach to address these very serious concerns so that they don't result in conflicts around the world.
Secretary Del Toro, Aspen audience, thank you very much. We are already at our time, but we look forward to seeing much more of you in years to come.
Thank you so much, sir. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Del Toro and Kevin Barron, for a very stimulating discussion. Good morning, everybody. Our next session today is entitled An Increasingly Adversarial World, Cross-Atlantic Perspectives. So the Aspen Security Forum was delighted to host the then Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab in March, when he launched the Integrated Review, which was one of the biggest foreign policy and defense reviews that the Great Britain had for, I think, a very long time, maybe since post-World War II. So just how Britain is repositioning itself after Brexit. So we're delighted today to have Dame Karen Pierce, who is the ambassador of the UK to the US with us, and then somebody else, Corey Shockey, who spent some time across the pond at IISS, but now she's back in Washington at AEI as a senior fellow and the director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies. Tom Wright is with us. He's the director for the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution, and he also just wrote a great book with Colin Cowell about what the world order looks like in the after COVID. And Matt Kaminsky, who is the editor-in-chief of Politico. So I look forward to a robust discussion. Please join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good morning. It's great to see all of you. I hope you've had your coffee and are ready for a great discussion. Maybe I can start with you, Ambassador. And this is, what is Global Britain? Can you give us a 30-second pitch?
30 seconds? I could do 30 minutes. 30 seconds. Global Britain, I think, is the answer to the Dean Acheson question, what is Britain for? What we want to be is a country that helps solve the leading world problems with a whole range of partners. We want to strengthen our alliances, particularly with the US and NATO, and we want to be a burden-sharing, problem-solving nation. Above all else, we want to do some real work to champion and strengthen open societies and open markets.
So after that softball, maybe I can follow up with something else, which is, looking at what's going on right now with Britain, you're fighting the French, not for the first time in the last 500 years, overfishing. There's an issue in Northern Ireland with the border there. Other issues with the EU. You are reducing your spending on, development and as well as defense. And how do you sort of square that reality today with the aspiration you just laid out?
I think the first thing to say is we've increased our defence spending, and that follows the integrated review that Neem mentioned earlier, and it's to take us into new technologies like AI and quantum, and it's also to help modernise NATO. So I think that's a very key part of Global Britain. We did reduce our development spend down from 0.7% to 0.5%, but it is going back up to 0.7%, as the government promised at the end of our financial cycle, years 24-25. We are defending our interests on trade with the European Union. As you say, there are disputes with France. I think it was the first time was in the 1830s that France first coined the phrase perfidious Albion. It's a label we reject, but it does show that there are some long-running bilateral issues, but France is a really important partner for us right the way across the globe. And then on Northern Ireland, just to say the border is not at risk. The Prime Minister made it very clear, both publicly and when he came to see the President and the Senate and the House recently, we are more than 100% committed to the Good Friday Agreement. We will not put a hard border on the island of Ireland, but we do have very serious problems with the Northern Ireland Protocol as it is currently affecting goods and communities within Northern Ireland.
So I obviously don't want to mean to pick on Britain, because I think across our Western world and across the world, you're seeing a lot of countries, that Donald Trump's war on multilateralism may be over, but certainly the era of a new multilateral age is not with us. Countries are really looking inward much more. And maybe Tom, I can turn to you here and say, when you look at Europe right now, the same dynamics that are playing out in domestic politics in the UK are playing out across the continent. And I wonder, what gives you the most concern about the Western alliance, whether it's NATO or the EU right now, and maybe what gives you some hope at a time when it doesn't seem like there's much optimism, having just come back from Europe, about either the future of sort of Europe or the future of a transatlantic alliance?
Yeah, thanks. I might start with the hope piece of it, because I actually am sort of hopeful, especially when we look at the great power sort of geopolitical element, right? I think what's sort of notable in Europe is how much Europe, both the UK and the EU, have sort of gravitated toward a policy on China that is at least compatible, not identical, but compatible with that of the United States, and I think there is a lot of potential for further sort of progress there. And it wouldn't necessarily, that was not necessarily obvious 18 months ago. I mean, you could imagine at the beginning of COVID that China could have driven a wedge between Europe and the United States because of the Trump administration's response, but that didn't happen, actually. And the UK and the EU both evolved, I think, significantly on China, including on 5G, and other issues. And I think, Brexit has, of course, been extraordinarily difficult, but in another sort of sense, you have a UK now that's sort of free to, I think, sort of pursue its own interests in the way that much of that sort of governing class wanted to do so over a 40-year period. And then you have an EU that's sort of freed from the obstructionism of the UK, right? So theoretically, both could sort of evolve in a greater sort of engagement with the world, potentially. But there's lots of teething problems on that, and I think what we're seeing, between France and the UK is, pretty concerning. I actually do think there's a US role there, but that's sort of on the optimism side. What worries me, especially since we're sort of talking a little bit about the great power piece on China, I am less worried about whether Europe and the UK will have a common position with the US in the Indo-Pacific. I'm much more worried that they will do what is necessary to be resilient and stronger vis-a-vis China, Russia, and others in Europe, right? And so I think the future of Europe as a region, as a regional order, that's, I think, where things are a little bit lacking, at the moment. And we need to think much more deeply about that. Brexit is a reordering moment in Europe. It's not just a, domestic politics thing. And the rise of China, I think, creates larger challenges for Europe as a whole.
Corey, if I can turn to you, since you tend to spend a lot of time looking at the Pacific much more. One, do you agree with Tom that there is a Western consensus on China, where I would say that when you look at some individual European countries, I see a lot of differences in how we had a Lithuanian deputy foreign minister here last night talking about their unique approach to China. And secondly, are we even talking about the wrong thing when we're talking about NATO? That really, and should the conversation between allies really pivot much harder toward thinking what are the security, what kind of security architecture do you need in Asia?
Those are both great questions. To the first one, I agree with Tom that we're at the start of a conversation, a transatlantic conversation about China. It started with the starting gun was the Huawei decision. And if you look at the start of that conversation, Europeans and the United States were in very different places. But Australia was the first country that made that decision. And I think it's not surprising that the US as a Pacific power is more aligned with Australia's view about China than with many European countries. But there are two reasons I think we should be even more hopeful than Tom suggests that the transatlantic conversation is converging. And the first is that China's behavior is genuinely reprehensible. And Europeans can't remain safe and prosperous if how China wants to change the international order succeeds. That is coercive commerce, small and medium-sized states not having rights or responsibilities, but being tributaries of stronger states. That's not an international order in which Europe will prosper. And so I think that's one reason that conversation is converging. The second is that, Americans occasionally get weary of being condescended to by our virtuous European partners. And if you think that virtue is not also going to be turned on China, once the German public realizes Volkswagen's using coerced labor in its plants in China, that's going to, the morality that drives common values in the transatlantic relationship is just going to expand those discussions into Asia. Predominantly not because the US wants it, or Australia wants it, or Japan wants it, but because China's behavior is destabilizing and dangerous to us all.
You invoke Germany. Maybe it's a question for all three of you. you have a new government coming in. It's a green, social democratic and free democratic, free Democrats. Free Democrats are not going to allow extra spending. The other two parties do not want higher defense spending. Germany has also been the country that's taken the most, let's call it the most mercantilist approach toward China. If you have the most important country in Europe that's actually going to go soft on security and has been soft on China, isn't that actually something that we should be more worried about if you're thinking about the future of NATO?
So I'm less concerned about Germany than you are for a couple of reasons. The first is we don't yet know what the coalition platform will be. It's still in negotiation. The Green Party has been a force for incredible good on this, even though they are not yet where I would like to see Germany be, that is meeting its NATO commitments to 2% of GDP on defense. They are actually a values-forward foreign policy force. And that's better than the CDU, CSU have been on China, as you rightly point out, Matt. So I think it's true that having the Liberal Party in control of the Chancellery will be problematic in the EU. That is, they will be a voice for continued austerity, which may not be the optimal policy for all European countries. But I don't think we should despair that Germany will take a serious role on managing China in Asia. And they already are, right? There's a German ship in the Pacific already. The Germans have been quite supportive. They understand they're no longer a frontline state in Europe, but the speech that Chancellor Merkel had the weakest person in her government on Russia give to the German Federation of Industry, which is, you will not be able to do business in Russia if there's no rule of law. That's easily extrapolatable to China too, and I think that's where we should expect them to get.
Ambassador, were you surprised or pleased that President Biden has continued former President Trump's hard line on China?
I wouldn't say either surprised or pleased, to be honest. It's not for me to evaluate the president's policies. But I think we do share a very strong sense, as both Corey and Tom have been saying, of what the rise of China means in the 21st century. And we very much share the president's emphasis on open societies and on making sure that technological and other developments are done in a way that preserves transparency, preserves multi-stakeholder models, government, private sector, civil society, and contributes very much to open markets. And I think that lends us, as Corey was saying, lends Europe, and including the UK, to come together on a certain model. We do share the concerns about human rights in China. We absolutely share the concerns about security in China, of the security aspect that China creates in the Indo-Pacific. We want a level playing field on trade. That's perhaps the best way of putting it. We do have a slightly different view from the United States on commerce with China, but this level playing field point, the Huawei point, critical national infrastructure points, there's a very strong identity of view there. What is striking is how bipartisan that view is here. I think from our side, we would very much welcome all of that China approach being accompanied by something that sets out what we are for. What is the offer to developing countries from the West these days? We can talk about freedom, we can talk about how important freedom is for the ordinary citizen, but can we actually offer something that genuinely competes with Belt and Road? That's something we want to work on with the Biden administration, with their Build Back Better world.
Just on Germany still, one last question. So after Angela Merkel leaves the Chancellery, who does Joe Biden call first in Europe?
That's to me.
Any of the three. One word answer, maybe. I don't know.
I mean, I think it's. I don't think there's an answer to that. Like, I don't think he's a preferred, partner. But what I can say, I think, is that I think Scholz if he becomes chancellor, is a very committed Atlanticist. I think he's someone who sort of thinks a lot about these issues. I think we'll see some significant departures from Chancellor Merkel, as of course, you would in any sort of change of government. And I think China is particularly sort of one of those. But I think you'll see sort of more continuity too. But I think the challenge for the Biden administration in Europe in terms of who do they call is really how much they want to elevate sort of the EU amongst sort of EU member states, right? And I think that's, the EU will never be the first and only call, right? There's no sort of answer to Kissinger's question like that. But I do think what they need to sort of think about for the next 3 years is how much do they want to elevate the EU, as an actor, and particularly vis-a-vis China. That's where most of the competencies to compete with China are. They're not actually in NATO. So you have to do sort of both. And of course, getting that NATO-EU synergy is something that's super bureaucratic and boring, but I think is, also still important. And the final thing I would say is, I think sort of managing these intra-alliance disputes is going to be an increasing challenge in a world of more competition and rivalry. And it's not just sort of the UK and France, Australia, right? It's Turkey, it's the EU generally in the UK, it's a whole bunch of different, it's South Korea and Japan. And I think we will see many, that's always existed, but we're going to see many more of those challenges because the stakes are sort of increasing globally, and there's more strategic decisions that have to be taken, and those decisions create friction and controversy. And so I think they need to sort of be thinking about how to manage, and future administrations, how to manage that as well.
Ambassador, I assume the answer to that question for you is self-evident?
Well, it's obviously 10 Downing Street and whoever's in 10 Downing Street at the moment. But I think Tom's absolutely right. If you want to compete with China and keep societies open and markets open, the EU is the third largest economy as a whole in the world. So obviously a lot of work has to be done with the EU on that. We're the fifth largest economy in the world. Japan is the fourth. You already have that grouping of states that not only share very common values, but actually are critical to a certain type of world trading system.
Should the US be in the Commonwealth?
It's not for me to say, but I think the Americans in the room would think that they fought a revolutionary war not to come into the Commonwealth. So you're very, very welcome. My favourite model. My favourite model, though, is actually George Bernard Shaw's The Apple Cart, where Britain becomes the 51st state. But at the end of the play, it's the British king that's running America. So I just leave that as an alternative model.
But listening to this conversation, it seems like there is a reshaping of how we are thinking about running the world. And I wonder if I think we should take this step more logically further, that NATO is an anachronism, that thinking in transatlantic terms is not the way that we are going to be able to really grapple with the most obvious threat to Western democracy and prosperity, which seems to be coming out of Asia. And so I wonder whether, do you think the Quad should really truly become a form of a new alliance? This is to all of you. I think, are we still kind of in denial because we're so used to thinking about the world for the last 70 plus years as being the world that was created, post-Yalta or post-48 when NATO was created?
So the architects of the NATO alliance, the American architects of the NATO alliance, thought it was going to be one of many. There was going to be a Southeast Asian treaty organization, a Central Treaty Organization. They sort of align the way combatant commands align in the Pentagon, and none of those others were sustainable because none of the others had the depth of commonality and in particular, not just the common security threats, but the common thinking about security threats, the economic heft to make a difference in it. I mean, America's closest allies are the countries that share our values and bring them to the fight. And that doesn't change when the geographic focus of what you're scared about changes. I think the reason, I mean, my whole career I've been looking for better allies than the Europeans to trade up to. And the problem is there aren't better allies to trade up to. And I think Europe's in the same position. The United States is a difficult, bulky, tiresome ally for our friends, and they don't have a better alternative. That's why they don't trade us in for something better. And when big problems manifest themselves, and we get scared, we want our friends next to us. And that's the secret of NATO's enduring value. You don't have those kinds of relationships in the Pacific, right? It's going to be much harder to get our friends and our allies in Asia to overcome the things that they don't like and resent about each other, to focus on the common challenges. And actually, NATO allies can be super helpful in that regard. I think as the AUKUS agreement shows, I think as the Quad shows, you're going to have a multiplicity of relationships that solve different kinds of problems, because you can't get that same kind of cohesion among our friends and allies in Asia.
I assume no dissenting views on that.
No, I mean, I agree. I would just add very briefly, I don't think we need a global structure. You know, I think that's unwieldy, and countries move at different speeds and they're in different positions, right? And I think the Quad works perfectly well and has obviously been deepening and improving in the Trump administration and in the Biden administration. There's no need to sort of expand that. There's lots of room for consultations with NATO, consultations with European countries. I think on the NATO transatlantic piece, the larger question is, I think this is something the president should address in the next 3 years, is what is sort of the role of the United States and Europe, as the Indo-Pacific becomes a more important theater, and how do we help sort of Europeans become more capable, not necessarily strategic autonomy or anything like that, but more capable of handling their problems when the US doesn't want to intervene. Now, that does not include the core mission of NATO. The US will always be sort of involved in that, but maybe the Balkans, maybe other sort of issues. So what's that conversation sort of like? I think how that sort of takes place, I think is a big piece of the puzzle.
Super. Let me ask one last question, and then if there's questions from the floor, please raise your hand, and maybe short answers. And I can start with you, Ambassador. How big a long-term price will the U.S. pay for the mishandling of the Afghan withdrawal? And keeping in mind that I believe you served in Kabul as well, so you have.
I think it was a more chaotic withdrawal than it needed to be, but at the end of the day, the United States, with allies like us, but primarily the United States, rescued over 120,000 people, and we mustn't forget that. But I think it's critical that, to coin an old phrase, we now win the peace, that we have a plan for stability in Afghanistan. It's very difficult, but there are big questions like conditionality around assistance. How do we help support human rights there? And I think all the allies need to get together, preferably under US leadership, for the reasons Corey was saying, and work out what now do we want to do to keep Afghanistan as stable as possible.
Do we have to engage more with the Taliban government?
There's a big question around recognition and how we engage, and what we as Brits would like to see is very much the international community moving in step on that. So I come back to the first point, we just need more discussion, policy discussion, about what our approach is now going to be.
Corey, do you agree with the Biden position that Afghanistan was a problem from 20 years ago and it's irrelevant to the geostrategic sort of future for us?
No, I think that's self-serving in the extreme for them to try and argue that. And the proof that it's not true is the anxiety of all of our allies who fought alongside us for 20 years in Afghanistan and are saying we weren't consulted on the American decision to abandon Afghanistan, and it caused a ton of problems for us the way that they did it. So it will make future coalition building more problematic and costlier for the United States that we did this way. I also think there's a second stream of problems with the decisions about Afghanistan, which is that it's making Asian allies nervous that if the US can't sustain political will to remain in Afghanistan when the major price had already been paid, how are they going to do the genuinely hard stuff like the defense of Taiwan if China should attack it? So I think the Biden administration has repairs to be doing in alliance relationships, especially because they came in crowing that America's back, baby, and we know how to do alliances. And that's actually not been the experience of allies in the Biden administration.
Tom, do you think it's a high long-term cost?
I guess I disagree with my good friend Corey on this. I think that there are two points I would make. I think obviously the withdrawal didn't go as anyone sort of intended, and they acknowledge that themselves. But I think, number one, I do think there's sort of a debilitating cost in a way to the national psyche and character over a long period of time to be conducting sort of an ongoing war that almost certainly would have escalated with a partner that wasn't very reliable, with no clear sort of strategic objective. So I think that's one point. And the second is, I don't think you can actually seriously pivot to the Indo-Pacific if you have the Pentagon sort of carrying out significant major day-to-day military operations in Afghanistan, right? I think that was a point the president made. I think that he described it. I don't think he said it was irrelevant, right? I think he said there were more pressing challenges that needed, the focus needed to shift to, and I think there's a large kernel of truth to that. That does not mean, as the ambassador said, that the US should not remain engaged. But I do think China is a more significant challenge, and I think we need to be making costly, difficult decisions in that regard, and this was one of those.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're just at zero on our time. So I'm sorry we didn't get a question in, but thank you so much to these three panelists.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you.